It's time for Supply Chain Now. Broadcasting live from the supply chain capital of the country, Atlanta, Georgia. Heard around the world, Supply Chain Now spotlights the best in all things supply chain. The people, the technologies, the best practices, and the critical issues of the day. And now, here are your hosts.
Hey, good afternoon. Scott Luton here with you on Supply Chain Now. Welcome back to the show. On today's episode, we're speaking with a leading provider of software and consulting for environmental and social product compliance and sustainability. This interview is part of our continuing collaboration with the Automotive Industry Action Group, also known as AIAG. So stay tuned as we look to increase your supply chain IQ. Quick programming note before we get started here. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to find us and subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. I want to welcome in my fearless and esteemed co-host on today's show, Greg White, serial supply chain tech entrepreneur and trusted advisor. Greg, good afternoon.
Hey, Scott, how are you?
Doing great. Back here again with the quite a stable of AIAG thought leaders, folks that support the organization, that speak at the organization, and it's really been it's such an informative series of interviews thus far.
Yeah, I mean, we've really enjoyed meeting with Bing and Jörg, and I can't wait to hear from Tolga. So pretty solid team we've got here, and of course, love the initiative that AIAG has with this summit. So let's get into it, man.
Absolutely. So perfect foreshadowing. So I want to welcome in our featured guest on today's episode, Tolga Yaprak, Senior Consultant, Compliance and Social Responsibility with iPoint. Tolga, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks. How are you guys doing?
We're doing great.
Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely.
Thanks for having me.
I know it's a challenging time for many, and but still a busy and a very eventful time. So I appreciate you carving some time out so we can share your perspective and thought leadership with our audience. So for starters, Tolga, before we dive into iPoint, all the good things you and the team are doing there, we want to know about you. So tell us more about Tolga, where you're from, and give us an anecdote or two about either your upbringing and or your professional journey.
Sure thing. Thank you. Thanks for having me, guys.
Sure.
And so I'm from Ann Arbor, Michigan. I went to Michigan State University, which a lot of people kind of turn around and they go, what?
Go Spartans.
That's right. Go green. So I went to Michigan State, got a degree in international studies and political science. But then I ended up becoming a teacher. And I went to Guyana to serve in the United States Peace Corps. So I did that for a while. I taught, and then I also moved to Turkey, to Istanbul. Beautiful city. In fact, I think maybe one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to. Met my wife there, and she was a teacher also. And then so we decided to move back home for me, back to Michigan, and got married, had kids, and then I got my MBA at Eastern Michigan University, where I sometimes teach a couple of their courses there as well.
Oh, wow.
Hey, tell me about, so the weather in Turkey as it compares to Michigan. Did your wife enjoy that?
I don't think there's a way that I could, say it without it being a complete understatement. When every day is perfect weather, when their winter is, rain, and then, Michigan is in almost perpetual winter from September to May, and then it's like 100 degrees with humidity. Weather's not the best for her.
Okay.
Doesn't always work out.
Well, hey, y'all are in love, and she can, as we all look past other elements, including weather, that's a wonderful story. Hey, let me ask you too about before we kind of move on in your professional journey, the Peace Corps commitment. That's a big commitment. I'm not sure how much travel you had under your belt when you committed to helping others through that 2-year term. Why did you do that? Why did you make that big commitment to help others?
Well, honestly, part of it was, you're at that age, 23, something like that, and, trying to find something to do. And as long as you can work a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet and answer, 50% of your emails, you can do about, 30% of any job. So for me, it was a matter of, all right, there's multiple different avenues I could choose, but I wanted it to mean something. And so joined the Peace Corps, ended up going to Guyana, which is, it borders Venezuela, Brazil, and Suriname. And honestly, it was the most eye-opening experience I've frankly ever had. And doing that, even though I continued to teach for a couple more years, when I did end up making the transition to business and getting my MBA, it started with Peace Corps.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So I love that. I'd love to just pick your brain more on those experiences, because so many folks don't get the opportunity in those early formative years to have those global experiences. But nevertheless, we're going to keep driving. From a professional journey standpoint, so you got back, it sounds like you earned your MBA, you were doing some part-time instruction. What else that led up to your current role with iPoint?
So I started to work in a company that deals with international trade and customs. And as a result, through that customs and customs compliance work, I kind of, jumped down the rabbit hole towards the corporate social responsibility compliance. We have all these different products coming in. We were already looking at, different trade value and tariffs and whatnot. And, over the last 15 years or so, we've really seen a big push where products now are not only valued on simply the components that it's made out of, but also who made it, where was it made, what are the materials that are inside, and now those are being tracked and monitored. So that's really how I started my career in this field. And then when I made the move to iPoint, within about a year or so, I attended just this grassroots event at a local university in Michigan, Wayne State. And there was I was going there actually I wanted to hear a speaker from the UN who was going to be there that I was really interested in. But there was a survivor, a victim of human trafficking. And she came up and she told her story. And my life hasn't frankly been the same since then. It was heartbreaking, yet at the same time, she was from Michigan, lived in Livonia. You can go to DetroitFreePress.com and check it out. And I realized how prevalent forced labor, modern slavery, human trafficking is everywhere. Even though we don't necessarily see it, it's a massive, massive industry. So that was a very big turning point for me and how I started to then build my career at iPoint.
Wow. That is, that's an impactful moment. I have friends who are very active in combating human trafficking and things like that. And I've only heard a few of those tales, and it's a travesty, and frankly it's hard to believe in a lot of ways that it goes on in today's society, but of course we all know that it does.
Yeah.
So how did that, how did that impact you in terms of what you do today with iPoint? Well, maybe you ought to share with us a little bit, if there's anybody that doesn't know yet, what iPoint does, and then tell us how you kind of turn that arc into what you do today.
Sure, absolutely. So iPoint, we are traditionally a software company. We build software that helps companies, whether it is an automotive OEM or a small electronics supplier, medical device, whatever it may be, in my opinion, really manage their data for compliance and reporting. A lot of that is customer reporting, which anyone who is involved in that area knows it can be really difficult. You know, they want it in XYZ format, ABC, etc. So it can be hard. And, you know, for the supply chain professional who is working with procurement and engineering, just trying to go through all the legacy data, I mean, it is just, it's a massive headache. And so what we do is we build software that lets different systems, you know, connect and speak to each other, and essentially report out for, you know, whether it's materials compliance like REACH or RoHS, or providing information in automotive industry for the International Material Data Sheet, IMDS. Mm-hmm. And then, so that's kind of our main, you know, bread and butter, what 90% of the people at the company do. But what I do is I could do consulting for conflict minerals compliance, which is, I would say, kind of the middle ground between materials and social responsibility, and anti-human trafficking or forced labor compliance. So I'll do a lot of the, you know, I'll go to a company and I will, you know, meet with their different relevant personnel. And by the way, I just on a side note, for anyone that works in either legal and or investor relations, or anyone that works in procurement, supply chain, etc., when you get those two different groups of people in the room, that can be the hardest conversation. A lot of times they've never met each other. Legal will come in and say, all right, you know, we need to do the following. If a supplier doesn't give us data, we're going to take them out of the supply chain. And of course, procurement and, you know, the supply chain personnel is like, what? You know, we can't just get rid of people that easy. So what I do is I find middle ground, build a due diligence program for them, and then actually operationalize it, you know, put it into effect, review it annually, do the reporting to the SEC, and, you know, repeat, essentially.
Wow. So it's interesting because in one of our other interviews, we talked with, and I think we might have mentioned this pre-show, with Ashton Carter, who is the CEO at the Dragonfly Initiative, or TDI Strategies, and they do a similar thing. Do you ever cross paths with them?
Absolutely. So the team that I work on at iPoint, we see the Dragonfly Initiative. Well, recently we haven't seen anyone physically for a while now,
right,
but
right. None of us have.
Yeah, exactly. But our paths cross quite a bit. It's difficult to be in the anti-human trafficking world and, you know, not be a hand's breadth away from Dragonfly.
So are you all doing complementary, cooperative, or however you say that, cooperatively competitive, or straight competitive type things, or
competition?
There you go.
That's good. I like that. So definitely, you know, no competition. The truth is the anti-human trafficking field for a long time has really been focused on the abolitionist movement. And, you know, especially when it comes to PR, the big thing is like sex trafficking, right? That's the one that everyone's talking about. It's always in the news. And it's certainly, it's easily the highest revenue generating sector of forced labor. But when it comes to volume, you know, you're talking about maybe 20% of all forced labor or human trafficking victims are in that particular sector. Almost everyone else is in some sort of labor, whether it's domestically or manufacturing, agriculture. So what we're trying to do, you know, my personal goal, I suppose, you know, for lack of a better phrase, is the supply chain is where everybody meets. It's the most, you know, global, polyglot institution that's not an institution. You know, it's a true market where everyone has connections to each other. You you may not, there are a lot of our customers who don't even know who 20% of their suppliers are because they outsource it, In fact, it's probably much higher than that.
They're a supplier's supplier? Does it work like that, Tolga?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like Conflict Minerals, it goes all the way to where the metal was dug up out of the earth.
Right.
So when you get all those aspects, you got some people who are on the law enforcement side who want to take, human trafficking rings to court, which is great. But for me, I think we as not only as a society, but specifically as a business society, as a business culture, we can make the most impact, the most effectively and efficiently if we all just essentially learn about our supply chain, find out who's doing what. Mm-hmm. Once we do that, you nip the problem in the bud.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about so many things that we want to do better in supply chain, sustainability, obviously ethicality like this. And it all comes down to economics. And if we hit the bad actors in the wallet, then we're going to get the kind of change that we want out of them.
Exactly. And the funny thing is maybe not funny, I suppose ironic might be a better phrase, but the more and more you look into it, you realize a lot of it is extremely straightforward. And a lot of the forced labor that happens, especially in like component manufacturing or agriculture, mm-hmm. is simply a matter of just people not knowing what it is. All the red flags are there, but they don't know what they're looking at. And
I think a lot of traditional business people don't even suspect it, so they wouldn't know what to look for, right? If you come at it through the lens of they're doing business like any other business, you're almost blind to what those red flags are.
I'll tell you just a quick anecdote. A few years ago, I was with a client and the CFO came in. And the CFO was there and the general counsel, assistant counsel, et cetera. And I'd been working with the supply chain people. And we were talking about, taking their anti-human trafficking program to the next step, right? So more than just having a blanket statement of, we don't have slaves, mm-hmm. Because obviously no one can prove that. So, we were talking about, well, how are we going to measure this? How are we going to, are we going to ask suppliers questions? What questions are we going to ask them? Are they going to be responsible for filling it out? So they come in and telling the CFO of, a company that's one of the largest in its entire industry that, hey, no matter what you think, I can guarantee you that there's forced labor in your supply chain. That can be a really awkward conversation.
Yeah.
They just immediately, no, I don't know. And then, you talk it out and starts to make a lot more sense, but it's not an easy topic to broach.
Yeah, I could see why you would be unaware of it. I mean, someone who's not engrossed in it every day would be unaware of it and then just in complete disbelief that it could be existent even, and then in greater disbelief that they are in some way perhaps inadvertently contributing to it.
Exactly. And honestly, that's the first step, is simply like the denial or getting past the denial, acknowledging that it exists. And then you can actually go further and say, all right, well, what products are at risk? Are there particular markets that are at risk? Then what am I going to do about it? And so that's where that's where I, myself, as well as iPoint is focused. We're trying to get, we're trying to operationalize anti-human trafficking, conflict minerals compliance, things that we can do to essentially make the world a better place.
So, and as you said, I mean, the problems you're helping your clients solve is first to recognize it, which, as you said, is a harsh and stark realization, right? Facing brutal facts in the most brutal way. And second, then what to do about it. So what at the highest level, I mean, I know there are probably thousands of things you could do, Tolga, but at the highest level, what do you do about it?
So there's essentially three, high level, three things that you do. Number one, you educate your team internally, right? So whether that is, whoever is taking ownership of this, usually it's legal, or a combination, dotted line to supply chain, or it's in supply chain, dotted line to legal, right? Mm-hmm. First, you just kind of educate that team. That team's got to know, what kind of risk actually exists, because it can make an impact on the materials that you're importing. But, we can save that one for later. Number two, you just have to simply educate your supply chain, on a very, very basic, like 5, bullet points. It happens. It exists. Keep your eyes open. Mm-hmm. Anytime, someone is keeping a passport, that's number one. That's the first red flag. If you have to pay to get a job, that's another. Some of those really, really simple red flags. And then lastly, you just like any other initiative, just got to collect data. Survey your supply chain. It doesn't have to be anything that is super complex. Just ask them. And I always recommend that customers give their suppliers the option to say, I don't know. Because frankly, that's the real truth. Anyone that says that they know for a fact that it's not happening and whatnot it doesn't really understand. But nonetheless, it's really that simple. Just, learn about it, figure out how it can affect your business, and then ask your suppliers.
Love it. So let's move from this point of the conversation around your role with iPoint and the company and some of the basic elements of your approach. As Greg suggested, we know that we are solving some very complex problems, and it's tough to kind of dissect that in less than an hour. But let's shift gears and go broader with the conversation now. So Tolga, as we all know, dealing with a complex, challenging situation, certainly for global supply chains, but really for everybody. As you survey the landscape, what's one thing or maybe even a couple things in particular that, whether they're developments or innovations or news stories or challenges even, what's on your radar more than others right now?
That's a great question. I think there's a few, several topics that we could talk about, but really, I think it's just one major market trend, and it's difficult to measure, on a day-by-day basis. It's more of a, very big picture kind of thing. But there was a British economist, 18th or 19th century, last name Schumpeter, I can't remember his first name, but he had this theory, or at least was the first one to call it a theory of disruptive innovation. So, as soon as one new innovation happens, it disrupts the entire supply chain, disrupts the market. Nothing's the same afterwards. Internet, rail, telephone, right? That kind of stuff. I think what we're seeing now is consumer empowerment and the availability of information. So we are at a point where so many different products are commoditized. I mean, you can go to the store, take a look at 4 different phones, and if you look at the specs, they're essentially the same.
Right.
What you do is you buy it based on, my kids have 3 iPads, so I might as well get an iPhone, so we can share the same, right? Like the purchasing decision that you're making is based on much more than the actual product itself.
Right, and the companies are finding more, to your point, finding more and more ways of enhancing that stickiness, right?
Exactly. And so a lot of the companies that are, really not just surviving but thriving are the ones that are taking hold of that. They are the ones that are at the forefront of, whether it's COVID or poverty or greenhouse gas emissions, Paris Climate Agreement. They're not waiting for the government. because to them, that doesn't matter. The people who are paying the money for their products. And one of the groups that doesn't get mentioned nearly as much as it should is the investors. Investor groups are transferring just unthinkable amounts of assets to SRIs, or socially responsible investments. So it's one thing to have like a consumer electronics company who is, all right, well, if I can't say that my phone is conflict free, people are going to buy the one next to it for $20 more. But when you talk about like medical devices, right, because you don't go into the ER and be like, hold on, is this X-ray conflict free? Is this scalpel made with, totally, that's not the first thing on your mind. But it's the investors that are pushing it, because they're the ones that control the direction of the company. So they have a lot of power to say, hey, look, the U.S. government may have pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, but you're not going to. Otherwise, we're going to take our investment somewhere else. And I think that with the consumer and the investment side, where you have people who are making the choice to spend their money, where it is, as well, of course, is the fact that now there are so many more different types of people around the world that have money to spend.
Right.
So that's the biggest trend that I'm seeing.
And that is providing more backstops to fuel CSR initiatives, right? Because if the consumers care about it, and Greg, it feels a little bit like Groundhog Day, because this just happened to be one of the common themes in a lot of these conversations we're having right now.
Yeah.
Consumers care about it. They're voting with their wallets and their purses. They care about what these companies are doing, what these brands are doing. And of course, by virtue of that, you're going to have investors that care about it as well, because they get that companies that figure out a successful CSR approach, and especially a company that's savvy enough to communicate the impact they're making. There is a lot of growth to be had, right, Tolga?
I mean, from 2017 to 2018, we went from $8 trillion to $12 trillion transferred to socially responsible investments. That is an unfathomable amount of money.
Sure.
That much capital being transferred specifically because a company can say, hey, you know what? I'm doing the right thing. Here's my proof.
And that, Tolga, I'm so glad you brought it back to that, because I think there's a lot of kindred spirits on this conversation, clearly with your commitment early on. Even if you at 20 or 21 years old, you wanted to see the world, and hey, I don't blame you at all. But still, I can tell, and hearing you tell that story and what you've done later in your career, and now what you're doing now, there's a give back as part of your DNA. And so, and I think the three of us share that. So I love, on its face, I love social responsibility programs and initiatives and companies that get it, and companies that invest in it, and they do it because, of course, there's a financial return, but they do it because it's the right thing to do, like you said, Tolga. All right, so before we shift over, for the sake of time, and Greg's going to ask you a question or two about AIAG and y'all's involvement there, any final words in terms of, Tolga, why we're seeing or how we're seeing that massive shift in the landscape that you just mentioned to? How many trillions of dollars did you say?
From $8 to $12 trillion just from 2017 to 2018.
Wow. Okay. Man.
Yeah.
Well then, so Greg, let's talk about AIAG.
Yeah. Well, can I take you back?
Sure.
I'm sorry. This is the first time we have really discussed forced labor and human trafficking this head on, right, Scott? So I got a few questions, right?
Sure.
And one is, I know that there are large groups, over 20 million people, and maybe that's even outdated data. You'd mentioned sex trafficking, but aside from that, what are the biggest offenders in terms of industries?
Great question. So first of all, 20 million is actually really, really close. So you've been keeping up very well. I think the latest estimate was 26 million in a particular year. So that's more of like a income statement as opposed to a balance sheet kind of view.
Yeah, yeah.
When you take everything together, I think it's a little over 40. Nonetheless, when it comes to industries, of course, there's always the monkey on the shoulder is that it's really hard to measure because people don't necessarily publicly state.
Raising the hand and saying, I'm
Yeah,
I'm a
exactly.
victim, right?
Right. They don't always, post their stats. But with that being said, there actually are a lot of really easy ways to monitor it. In fact, just as a quick anecdote, one of the coolest ways that I've seen technology work in this area is, I don't know if I can name them by name, so I won't, but there was a financial services company a few years ago, and they facilitate the exchange of money between people across borders. And they were able to just take, terabytes of data and identify human trafficking hotspots because of money that was being sent from at-risk areas to a couple villages in Bulgaria. Yeah. So even though they couldn't necessarily get the industry down, they were able to track the money. And that was a huge success. So it's certainly possible. But industry-wise, number one, anything that's manual, agriculture. And that includes manufacturing too. We outsource a lot of our manufacturing work all around the world. And it's really easy to say, obviously there was the shoes issue many years ago with the sweatshops.
Right.
Several years ago, there was the issue with component manufacturing in Southeast Asia. And those are only the ones that we see. A lot of it goes underground. So shrimp farming, any of the food, textiles, cotton, anything that requires manual labor. Yeah, construction, yep, all of it.
Interesting. Well, and Asia, that area of the world is the biggest concentration. I think many people have been, they've been introduced to a fairly large ethnic group in China, Uyghurs, that are basically a large portion of that ethnicity is forced into slave labor, essentially.
Yep.
Right.
North Korea, actually, I think they're the only country that actually exports people, their own people, as a good. Everyone, or I shouldn't say everyone, people that work in this field are aware that North Korea will send large groups of workers to go work at a factory somewhere else. So instead of, instead of exporting like timber or iron ore or, semi-processed metals or whatever, they'll actually export their labor.
Wow.
And Mexico, they've been found in a shipping yard in Poland. So it can be anywhere.
So clearly AIAG has a very strong corporate responsibility initiative, and that's what this whole summit is about. And this is a really very serious issue. And one of the things we've been asking a lot of the participants that we've interviewed is what sort of value has this brought to you personally, or your company, or your initiative? How do you benefit, or how do you see members benefiting from AIAG and their membership and these sorts of summits and events?
Sure thing. So I've worked with AIAG for many years, including before I was at iPoint. I was with my previous employer. I worked with them and took part in different committees and whatnot. And so there's two main or I should say two primary value adds through AIAG. First and foremost, they move the needle. They really do. You know, not every company can be a Google. Not every company can be a Microsoft. And so, you know, there are some companies that have a chance or an opportunity to do good work and communicate that, right? And of course, the market reacts. But, you know, not everyone has that kind of budget. But if you can mobilize not just, you know, a couple of silos, when you can mobilize the network, then you're talking about real change. And that's what AIAG has been. In fact, their acronym, the expanded version of their name is the Automotive Industry Action Group.
Yeah.
And that is 100% accurate. They are the embodiment of action. And that kind of goes to the second point, which is, you know, there are some cross-industry groups and or industry-specific groups where it's a lot of executives. And it's kind of, you know, it's a nice, fun kind of thing, but that's just kind of, you know, that's it, really. They don't really do much. You know, you can put the label on your website, hey, I'm a member of this. But at AIAG, the people that are there, the volunteers from the member companies, they're there because they care. They care. You know, they're not there for the publicity or anything. And same with AIAG employees. So they have this just amazing work ethic. And they, you know, honestly, I'm shocked that every single business school in the country isn't doing, you know, case studies on their success every year, because they've been able to mobilize an entire industry, the entire supply chain for that industry, many different tiers, all the way down to raw materials, and they make a difference. And so that is something that, you know, no one could ever take away, and I have so much respect for them. And having worked with them for so long, honestly, they're just really down to earth, really nice people.
You know, we've really enjoyed working with Jim and Tanya and the team, and I have to agree 100% with you there. That's for sure.
But they are about action, deeds, not words, and that has stood out from our earliest conversations. So I want to echo that sentiment. That's so important in this day and age of, unfortunately, lip service leadership is not going away. It's part of certain organizations' DNA and culture. And so when you partner with a group that is about action, it's always refreshing, I think. So on that note, let's make sure, I bet, Tolga, I'm just going to go out on a limb here, and I bet you have got some of our listeners really thinking about some of your observations and your expertise and perspective. So let's make sure our listeners know how to reach out and connect with you and iPoint. So tell us more.
Sure thing. So I would recommend LinkedIn. It's always great. Message directly through there. I think that would be the best way. Just connect to me directly. And then for the company, we're www.ipoint-systems.com. You'll be able to see all of our webinars with Homeland Security, all the different groups that we work with for regulations, and all of our free, you know, resources and whatnot, and all that information is there.
Love it. And, you know, Greg, one of the things I really like about iPoint is their support of AIAG, right? This is tough times for anyone trying to hold an event to help people get better at what they do and operations to get better at what they do. And clearly iPoint's support is helping this event take place in the first place. So on that note, Tolga, really appreciative of you and your team and your industry leadership and your support of making things like this summit, upcoming summit, take place.
Well, thanks, guys. I really appreciate your time. It's been my pleasure.
All right. Greg, we've been talking with Tolga Yaprak, Senior Consultant, Compliance and Social Responsibility with iPoint. And wow, I think I wish we had about 3 more hours to dive into some of the things, some of the meandering ways that these conversations always take place, huh?
Yeah, I think, this is a particularly poignant topic because we're talking about human beings here, right? And, we're not talking about somebody ripping you off for $20 by charging you a higher price. We're talking about somebody controlling your life. And, it's a very important topic and interesting and I think particularly important that iPoint and TDI and AIAG are continuing to focus on this in these economic and health times when they could be focusing inward, and it would be very easy to think about or forget about these kind of issues in the world. And I think it's it's commendable that they continue to focus on helping people get their lives back.
Absolutely. That's great perspective to wrap up the conversation on. So Tolga, all the best to you, your team, your family. Look forward to reconnecting with the iPoint team at the summit. To our audience, again, you can connect with Tolga on LinkedIn or learn more about the organization at iPoint-systems.com. Lots of expertise there. So good stuff. All right, Greg, we got to wrap up the conversation here today. We want to point our audience to supplychainnowradio.com for a variety of industry thought leadership, much like we heard from Tolga here today. And we want to ask, if you enjoy the conversation, hey, find us and subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. On behalf of the entire team, Scott Luton, Greg White, wishing you a successful week ahead. Stay safe, don't panic, but please do follow the expert advice and precautions that have been distributed by your local healthcare authorities. And if you know anything, hold the faith. Brighter days lie ahead. And we're going to see you next time here on Supply Chain Now. Thanks, everybody.